Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We will begin shortly with observing the formal protocols, but for now, I'd just like you to be directed to the chat feature. You will see that our book giveaway winners have already been announced. So if you have if your name is listed there and you are a lucky winner, please do contact Ferial. Her details are on the event poster. So congratulations. There will not be a live Q&A after the lecture, but we do encourage you that throughout the proceedings today, put all your questions, your comments, your queries, your opinions in the chat box, which should be located on the right-hand side of your screen. So this is an informal welcome from me, Dr. Lishani Kudemans. I'm the Senior Researcher in the Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape. But I'd now like to call on my colleague, Dr. Megan Robertson, who is going to assist me in contextualizing and orientating this event. Megan, whenever you're ready, welcome.
September 2019 was dubbed the September of Sorrow in South Africa, a month in which the country shook as gender-based violence, attack after attack, came to light. A man murdered his wife after a marriage counseling session. A 25-year-old boxing champion was shot dead by her ex-boyfriend, who was a police officer. A 19-year-old student at the University of Cape Town, Uyanene Ngwe Chana, went to fetch a parcel from her local post office, where she was raped and bludgeoned to death by a post office worker. Not even a week later, an 18-year-old first-year student registered in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of the Western Cape, Jessie Hess, was found raped and murdered next to her 85-year-old grandfather, who was also murdered in their home. Indeed, the country was in mourning and deep sorrow. But we were reminded that sorrow is not enough. September 2019 was a stark reminder that even the most progressive legislative change and policies are not enough to ensure women's safety because, as Mbuyiselo Botha wrote, women are dying with protection orders in their handbags. Feminist scholars of religion have convincingly shown that laws and policies do not function independently of the religious and cultural values that people hold about gendered norms. Interrogating religious and cultural belief systems about gender is therefore as critical in gender-based violence interventions as making laws and policies about it. Based on this premise, the Saatchi Chair in Religion and Social Justice, under the auspices of the Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice, has since 2017 been hosting an annual lecture during August to interrogate the role that religion and culture play in the pervasive power of patriarchy and to question why violence against women continues unabated. We have proposed to name this annual lecture in its fourth cycle after Jessie Hess. Unfortunately, the disruption of COVID has halted this process for now, but invoking her name in this space today remains important. Soon after the murder of Jessie Hess, the Justice for Jessie campaign was started to bring attention to her case. The movement was first mobilized in order to pressure police to find and prosecute Jessie Hess's murderers. While the rapist murderers have since been identified, the grief on campus is still palpable. And our need to remember her in particular as one of our own, but also as a symbol of the collective, remains significant.
The recent call from students to name the new arts building at UWC, the Jessie Hess Arts Building, is a tender gesture that demonstrates the deep sorrow that her absence invokes. At times, this sorrow is overshadowed only by the searing rage that bubbles beneath the surface of the many women students who know that to live in a state of fear and hyper-awareness is still not enough to keep them safe in and from a society that believes that their lives are disposable. The underlying impetus of the Justice for Jessie campaign requires a critical interrogation of the systems, the beliefs, the practices that reinforce and support violence against women. Jesse Hess's life, murder, and constitutive absence holds great significance for the community of staff and students at UWC, who in 2020 celebrate 60 years of UWC's existence, but will also commemorate the strong tradition of the University of the Left that consciously and intentionally opposes injustice, contained in its slogan, Hope Through Action. Jesse Hess's UWC's painful and powerful reminder of the significance of thinking and talking and working to interrogate and transform the ways in which society produces and sustains violence against women. In August 2012, a different yet familiar violence terrorized Black bodies at Marikana. The bloodshed on that day in many ways disrupted what has in many instances become a superficial celebration of women, what Professor Sarojini Nada, the director of the Desmond Tutu Centre, calls the pink goodie bag occasion. The Marikana massacre remains a sordid reminder of the multiple ways in which economies of violence sustain indignity, poverty, and result in violence and death for women, for queer people, for people of color, and for marginalized men. Justice for Marikana is still outstanding, as it is for the countless women whose lives have been taken brutally from them and from us. Today, we'd like to conclude this orientation to the lecture by invoking the name of Nathaniel Julius. As Cleo Shea, a Wit student, said on her Instagram page, he was 16. He was 16 and disabled. He was 16 disabled and unarmed. He was 16 disabled, unarmed, and colored. He was 16 disabled, colored, unarmed, and killed at the hands of police brutality. And might I add that he was also holding a biscuit. So we say his name, and with this as our backdrop, we welcome you to our 4th annual Economies of Violence public lecture. We begin with a trigger warning to protect those who may in this moment feel particularly vulnerable, for whom this may just be too much at this time. We hold space for you, but we understand if this is not the space for you at this time. However, we don't underestimate the value of a trigger for all of us. We urge you to listen deeply, to engage critically, and to respond courageously. With that, be welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Robertson. So with that, we will begin the formal proceedings before the lecture, and it is my most sincere and deep honor to welcome Professor Tyron Pretorius, the Vice Chancellor and Rector of the University of the Western Cape, who will now, from the auspices of his office, open this event. Professor Pretorius, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I'm not sure whether our Archbishop and Chancellor of the University has joined us, but I was informed that he would be here. So I'd like to warmly welcome Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, also Reverend Dr. Tracy West, Professor of Christian Ethics and African American Studies, Drew University Theological School. I acknowledge Prof. Sarojini Nada, Saatchi Chair in Religion and Social Justice, and also the Director for the Desmond Tutu Centre. All of my UWC colleagues, I acknowledge you. All other guests, you are welcomed. Good afternoon. I'm really honored to welcome you to the Economies of Violence Symposium that will reflect on the commemoration of Women's Day and the 8th anniversary of the Marikana massacre. Both of the subjects under discussion today are uncomfortable issues to deal with because, firstly, how can we celebrate Women's Day or even Women's Month in South Africa when the place of our women are so contested and vulnerable? Secondly, the commemoration of what we call the Marikana massacre remains a deep wound in our young democracy, a day that will always be remembered for the single most brutal act of violence perpetrated by the South African police in post-apartheid South Africa. These two commemorations are so vastly different. The one, the UN Women calls the shadow pandemic, and the other an act of violence against striking minors. Yet I believe that there is a thread that binds these two events together, and that is vulnerability and the inability of individuals to defend themselves against their aggressors. Let me first pause at the commemoration of Women's Day, a day that underscores the huge distance between our constitution that promises equality for all and the reality of an entrenched patriarchal system that refuses to give way to that equality. If we didn't know this before, or if we ignored it before, the national lockdown has shown with brutal clarity the pervasiveness of violence against women. Consider this. During the first week of the lockdown that started on the 27th of March, more than 2,000 cases of GBV were reported. And the numbers just kept on growing in the following months. We understand that more than 120,000 victims called the National Helpline for Abused Women and Children in the first 3 weeks after the lockdown. On the 9th of August, we celebrated the courageous women of this country when they marched in their thousands to the Union building to protest the caste system and to fight for the equality of all. It's not that our women have become less courageous than those who marched in 1995. It's just that far too many of our men believe that they have the right to act as violent aggressors against women. What an indictment it is when the last remaining leader of the 1956 march, Sophie de Bruyn, condemns what's happening in South Africa. And I quote from her message on Women's Day, open quote, "The face of poverty, the face of a lack of safety, the face of inequality, always it is the face of women that comes to mind," close quote. Sophie de Bruyn goes further to say that defeating gender-based violence asks that we build an alternative society, one in which human life is respected and protected by each of us and by the state. This brings me to Marikana, that bleak event in our recent history where life was not protected by the state, but where 34 lives were taken when police opened fire on striking miners from Lonmin in the Northwest Province. Who can forget the images from 8 years ago? The man in the green blanket and the lifeless bodies spread across the Marikana kopje. Even today, it brings back a sense of unreality, because these are images that belonged in apartheid South Africa and events like the Sharpeville massacre, not events that we expect in a post-apartheid democratic South Africa. What underscores the strategy is the fact that there are many unanswered questions about that massacre. One of the widows has said, an apology is the most important thing. And we are still waiting that one day God will use the hearts of those in power to come and apologize to us. We will forgive them, but we need that apology. Last year, our university felt the deep pain of losing our own, Jessie Hess, only 19 years old and a first-year student at UWC. When we have these events, it's always with the pain of remembering a young life cut short. It's always about remembering the pain of that moment. I'm therefore immensely pleased that an annual lecture in the Department of Religion and Theology has been established in Jessie Hess's name, because it will always serve as a reminder of how close the shadow pandemic is to all of us. The Desmond Tutu Centre has over the years delivered vibrant intellectual events. This one promises to be another, and I look forward to Reverend Dr. Tracy West delivering her keynote address. You are all formally welcomed. I thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Pretorius, Vice Chancellor and Rector at UWC. Thank you for speaking truth to power. I think that it's both inspiring and aspiring when someone who holds such an important and significant office is willing to be vulnerable in a space such as this. And I appreciate, and I know that all of our participants appreciate your welcome today. With that, I am once again extremely pleased and honored to welcome Professor Monwabisi Kgalagala, who took up the position of Dean of the Faculty of Arts in January 2020, and has since then been deftly and with great compassion leading us through these trying times. Welcome, Dean Kgalagala. So pleased to have you with us today. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. I really appreciate the moment. Colleagues, as I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Chancellor, sort of echoing the words of my Vice Chancellor, Prof. Pretorius, and also acknowledging him for sharing with us his welcome. Apart from that, I'd like to also acknowledge Professor West, who's our keynote this afternoon, and also express, acknowledgement to the center, Professor Nada, the leadership of the center, as well as the team, who has worked behind the scenes. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, special welcome to all of you. In South Africa, we would cite, some of the greeting forms in the different languages by saying good afternoon, molweni, goeiemorgen, sanibonani, dumelang, abshen. I think it has become a standard practice. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, it delights me to welcome you at this important online public lecture meant to commemorate the Women's Month as well as the Marikana massacre. I must point out that upon receiving the request to perform this function, I was a bit reluctant. Of course, my reluctance was due to the fact that the sudden switch to the new online mode of interaction and deliberating is a little bit strange to some of us, and as such it takes away the human element as we know it. It also takes away the meaningful engagement, but we will try and get used to it because it's the new normal, especially when deliberating, on critical subjects like the commemoration of the Women's Month. But I must also point out that my reluctance was overcome by one or two things. The first one, the very important work being championed by the SACHI chair in religion and social justice, which is meant to advance research through our interdisciplinary approaches with a view to rethink and reframe issues of gender, issues of religion, issues of sexuality in South Africa today. And it's also important to say this important work has nudged some of us to realize that the time for slogans is over. The time for slogans is over. It is time for action now, given what is happening in our world. It is time for programs that will deliver viable solutions to our societal challenges, as it is the case with the Centre advancing such work. The second reason which is responsible for overcoming my reluctance on a lighter note is that I felt I could not say no to such a humble request expressed by a woman of God, Professor Nada. Otherwise, I will end up, which I thought, in serious trouble with God. Hence, I acceded to the request, and I'm also participating this afternoon as part of this big event. I must say special thanks to the team putting together this wonderful event, as the Vice Chancellor has pointed out. It's a special event despite the prevailing circumstances. I have been made aware that this public lecture is constituted by a sizable number of attendees joining us, from all over the world, I'm told, to facilitate fruitful sharing from the various parts. Ladies and gentlemen, you're most welcome. The unique context, I must point out, the unique context and ethos of our university, including the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, its commitment to disadvantaged communities, and its vision, which is captured nicely in one or two phrases, a place of quality, a place to grow, continues to provide a challenging and intellectually stimulating environment for, critical issues such as what we're discussing this afternoon. And I think with this unique history of struggles and resistance, I'm delighted that our Desmond Tutu Centre, under the leadership of Prof. Nada, has taken the ownership of hosting this public lecture. The theme of the lecture, as you might have picked up from the program, Economies of Violence, is a relevant one, well thought through, as it speaks to broader issues facing our larger society. Most crucially, this question speaks to our unique South African context, history, and the challenges facing society in general. It is my sincere hope and trust that this lecture will provide space and platform to enrich conversations with wider implications for the transformation of societies and the ongoing struggles for justice. And I have been made aware that Dr. Tracy West is responsible for this conceptualization. Special welcome to her, who is our keynote speaker this afternoon. We are all, I believe, looking forward to your fruitful sharing, ma'am. With these few words, I would like to once again extend a very warm welcome from the faculty and wishing you the best of fruitful sharing and meaningful engagement. Thank you very much.
Dean Khalakhala, thank you so much, not only for that welcome that showed your intimate understanding of the issues that the center is deeply engaged with intellectually and materially, but also for your continuous support of the center for our vision and of our work. So thank you very much, Dean Khalakhala. With that, I would now like to hand over the proceedings to three young leaders who will set the scene for the rest of today's lecture, well, the rest of today's program. The first person is Ryan Koloti, a master's student in our center. His work explores the topic of sexual violence and pastoral care. Ryan will light a candle in memoriam of those whose lives have been taken through state violence and GBV. I then want to introduce you to master student Sakina Dramat, whose work is focused on issues around epistemic injustice in the representations of Islam in the media. And Sakina will share a few lines of prose while Toby lights the candle. Thereafter, we will observe a moment of guided reflection, and then actor, director, writer, poet, and anti-GBV activist Veronique Jefters will present a poem. So with that, I'll hand over to Toby and Sakina. Thank you so much.
The candle being lit tonight casts a shadow. The shadow draws all those who have gone into the ancestral realms to the light. As we remember each by name in our hearts, we also remember our beloved Elise Brown. We imagine their spirits and their lives full of light and goodness, and we hold each of them in our hearts.
Dear Mr. President, we come to serve you lunch and even spill a little tea on your fancy suit. Your silence echoes loud and it speaks 1,000 words now. I know you are trying to forget to move forward, business as usual, but allow us to stop you in your tracks, preach and read you a little verse, because this is the 0 to 100 of we have had enough of you and your ministers in your bulletproof cars and big houses paying us no regard. See, now I know you are busy fighting our current situation, and God knows COVID-19 has become the alpha and omega, but what about the femicide in your country? Oh, is Becky Trele and Lamini Zuma too busy figuring out what the next ban is to notice gender-based violence has been hitting the fan? Is John Steenhuisen too busy going to court for matters raised by South Africans to actually give a damn about South Africans? This is war, so put your weapons to use, because blood has been flowing from one too many taps, and I hope that it drips and drips and drips and drips into your fancy suit, and that the stain is impossible to get out. I need you to know that they have been born again in me and have set my spirit alight. I will house their names in my mouth and change my address to theirs, so that they may dance gracefully from my tongue to broken records you have recorded for them. And while I would love to list the names of all the people who have fell victim to the illness in this country, I would love to take a moment of silence. May that echo in halls and in churches and at the grocery store may it scream, I went on a hunger strike. May it scream, we worshipped together. May it scream, I was allegedly raped in my house, at school, at church, in a field. No, may it scream, I was raped. We are heartful and yet we are so hopeful. Still, I hope the blood stain on your fancy suit never wash out. I hope it stays as a constant reminder. I hope it screams, something happened here, something is happening in my country, and I hope that it screams, we continue to be let down by our president.
Thank you, Veronique. Thank you, Sakina. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for sanctifying this space for the proceedings that will come, for the intellectual engagement that will follow. And for that, and from there, sorry, I would like to welcome and introduce you to the moderator of this event, Professor Surajni Nada. Her name has been invoked by the Dean and by the Rector, and it is my honor to introduce her to you all, although I'm sure she needs no introduction. So Professor Surajni Nada is the Director of the Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice. Prof. Nada also holds the Desmond Tutu Saatchi Research Chair in Religion and Social Justice and is an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary researcher within the fields of gender and religion, with a more broad focus on religion and social justice, spanning issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Beyond her extraordinary track record as a researcher and a teacher, Prof. Nada is also a natural leader who inspires by intellectually and materially defying the activist, academic binary through her scholarship and her disposition. At both the micro level of mentorship and the macro level of institutional practice, Prof. Nada embodies an unwavering commitment to social justice. UWC as an institution, and we as her colleagues, her partners, and students in the center are better people and researchers as a result of her leadership and her friendship. So Prof. Nada, for providing this space for us with your vision and your support, we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shani Kudemans, and thank you for being the Director of Proceedings this afternoon. Depending on where in the world you are joining us from, good afternoon, good day, good morning, and all our South African greetings as well. A special greeting to our dear friend and honored guest for this afternoon, Dr. Tracy West. Tracy, thank you for accepting our invitation to be our speaker this afternoon. We don't really observe enough protocol, I think, in the Tutu Centre, but today I do want to acknowledge the leadership at the University of the Western Cape who are present this afternoon. I want to say a special thanks to the Vice-Chancellor and the Rector, Professor Tyrone Pretorius, and the Dean of our faculty, Professor Monwabisi Khalakhala, who have both welcomed you this afternoon. I would also like to acknowledge Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, who serves as the Chancellor at the University of the Western Cape and who is present this afternoon. A longtime friend and associate of the Centre, Reverend Canon Dr. Vicente Shakhabe, who's also the Rector of the College of Transfiguration in Makhanda, welcome. And to all of you who are joining us on this virtual platform, welcome to the Desmond Tutu Centre annual August Economies of Violence public lecture. As you have already heard, we have been hosting this event since 2017, and we very intentionally steer the event away from the nauseating Women's Month pink goodie bag events, where people seem to engage in pedestal patriarchy and tell us that women are children who are precious flowers that need protection. Eusebius McKaiser, who was our keynote speaker at our event last year, very helpfully drew the links between slave labor, which some would argue was the reason for the Marikana protest, and gender-based violence. He reminded us that at the heart of toxic masculine violence is the belief that those on whom that violence is enacted are not fully human or are possessions. The belief that Black laborers, women, queer people, and other people on the margins are not human or simply possessions is what sustains the violence against these bodies. To pretend that it is anything other than these beliefs, for example, to think that it is alcohol or poverty, is simply to put a band-aid on an amputation. McKaiser reminded us after that lecture in an op-ed piece, and I quote him, that we wrongly describe rapists and murderers as monsters or animals. They are not monsters, they are not animals, he says. They are everyday men. And I would add that they are everyday men whose beliefs about women and Black workers are to be found in their religious value teachings. You know, those pesky little passages about women's submission and slaves being obedient, they take on meaning somewhere. Unfortunately, often in the violated bodies of the submissive and the obedient. When Ferial, our administrator, shared the video that she compiled, by the way, that you just watched, of the media reports rolling story after story about the horrors of Marikana in 2012 and about the horrors of gender-based violence cases in our country, most from just this past year, actually. We wondered in our planning group how we would be able to get through our formalities without breaking down. We wondered how we would issue trigger warnings for those of us who had experienced trauma through the viewing. We wondered perhaps if the video was not too hard-hitting. Hard-hitting it is. Yet we took a decision that, trigger warnings notwithstanding, we needed to bring the horror of the violence into the space. For it is of no use to pretend that this pandemic of violence against the bodies of those who are rendered female in this country is not horrific. And it is further no use pretending that those who perpetrate this violence are always strangers in dark alleys or bad, evil people who are not religious or hold no cultural allegiance. Oh no, these are people who can cite their sacred scriptures, and these are people who will tell you how our cultures demand that women be subservient or that women dress modestly. And so this is why we are in our 4th year of doing this lecture. It is because we believe that gender inequity is at the heart of this pandemic of toxic violence in our communities. And we believe that gender inequity is not resolved through legislation alone. Gender inequity is sustained by religious and cultural beliefs and people who teach that men are the heads of their households, people who ignore or minimize women's voices in leadership, people who still insist on using male language for God and for clergy, religious leaders who are more offended by the indecency of panty protests than they are about the indecency of the pandemic of gender-based violence, people who endorse religious leaders who think it's funny to say that women are cute when they are mute. We continue to host this lecture because we believe that there is a direct link between these belief systems and the pandemic of violence. We host this lecture because indeed we believe that while religious belief systems hold so much of the blame for the intersectional violence we experience, we also know that religion holds possibilities for transforming societies. Indeed, we take seriously the paradox that an ethics of justice and equality is both prevented by and made possible through religion. And so we are so pleased to have Professor West to help us to work through this paradox. And with that, I warmly welcome you all to participate freely and courageously in this, our fourth annual Economies of Violence lecture. Welcome.
Thank you for that, Professor Nada. I imagine that if we were together at this point, the lecture venue would have erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. This is one of the things that Corona has robbed us of, the opportunity to engage with each other in an embodied fashion. But thank you so much for that introduction. It has certainly set the scene. Right now, I would like to introduce you to one of our PhD candidates, Elizabeth Peterson. Elizabeth's work, her area of research is in the area of intimate partner violence and religion. And Elizabeth will do the introduction to our speaker, Professor Tracy West. Immediately following her introduction, we will, the lecture will then be played. So please do sit tight. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Good evening, friends and colleagues. I am deeply honored to be able to introduce to you one of the world's leading social ethicists as our keynote speaker this afternoon. It is a particular joy for me to introduce Reverend Dr. Tracy West, since I've known her as an activist colleague and mentor for a number of years. I also had the privilege of assisting Dr. West or Professor West with her research for her most recent book. Tracy is Professor of Ethics and African American Studies at Drew University Theological School. She's an author of several books. Two of my favorites are Disruptive Christian Ethics, When Racism and Women's Lives Matter, and then her most recent book, Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, Africana Lessons on Religion, Racism, and Ending Gender Violence. She is a celebrated author who has published numerous articles and book chapters on sexual, gender, and racial justice, as well as gender-based intimate violence and clergy ethics. Professor West seamlessly merges her academic and activist commitments. As such, she has testified before the New Jersey State Legislature in support of marriage equality, protested on behalf of the LGBTQI equality at the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. She was interviewed in a documentary on violence against Black women, and she received the Auburn Seminary's inaugural Walter Wink Scholar Activist Award. We are therefore delighted to welcome Professor West to deliver the keynote address tonight. We are confident that tonight's lecture will be inspiring and challenging, and that we will all accept the invite to engage meaningfully or in meaningful conversation around the intersecting systems which support the economies of gender-based violence. And so with those words, let us welcome Professor West, who will speak to us this evening.
I want to express my deepest gratitude to the Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice for the opportunity to deliver this lecture, especially to Professor Nadar, who extended the invitation, and to Farial, who helped me with so many details. Today, I am extremely honored to participate in this commemoration of the 1956 anti-apartheid march by over 20,000 women and the remembrance of the 2012 killings of minors protesting their egregious working and housing conditions. I dedicate my emphasis on disruptiveness and on a definition of economies of violence as structural knowledge, beliefs, and social and political practices to that legacy of protest. I've learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues there in South Africa. Ever since I reached out to Professors Gerald West and Beverly Haddad, over a decade ago at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I said I was interested in meeting activists. They didn't know me, they welcomed me, hosted me, and that began a long journey of interactions for me with many activists there in South Africa. In my view, transnational solidarity is a crucial ingredient for the task of ending gender violence. The work of building it is hard and risky, but we need each other because of the transnational border-crossing manifestations of the problem, and also because of the potential and the power that we have for ending the violence that can be found in transnational solidarity. As I conducted my most recent research project on Africana activist leadership, I focused on issues of religion and racism and ending gender-based violence. I interviewed activists in Ghana and Brazil, but I knew that I also needed to go to South Africa. I was interested in what we here in the US can learn from activists there in the work, not of crisis intervention, but of confronting deep racist economies that structurally support gender violence. I cannot overstate the depth of the generosity and wisdom and knowledge that so many scholars and activist leaders in Pietermaritzburg, in Durban, in Johannesburg, and in Cape Town extended to me. For example, activist scholar Elizabeth Peterson, wearing her hat as executive director of South African Faith and Families Institute, graciously introduced me and created dialogue sessions for me with Cape Town leaders who were from a range of faith backgrounds, worked on a wide range of issues of gender-based violence, including sex trafficking, the targeting of Black lesbians for rape and murder, including issues of sexual and domestic violence. So many, many, many leaders. So today I want to mention just a few of the approaches to economies of violence that have been pivotal in my own journey of studying and organizing against gender-based violence. I focus the main pieces I want to focus on today really coalesce around the question, what methods do we need for dismantling racist and religious economies of violence that nurture gender violence? We need intersectional, experience-based methods. We need Christian ethical concepts and practices that mutually inform each other in our method. We need defiant spirituality that feeds transnational Africana solidarity in our method. In short, I love method. I love method because it highlights the choices we make to achieve our anti-racist gender justice goals. The path we take, method is the path we take, and it's crucial to getting there, isn't it? So, absolutely essential is a sharp, unwavering focus on disruptive methodological approaches that interfere with the moral permission given to death-dealing economies of violence. We have to nurture moral insistence on creative communal ways of generating well-being for the most vulnerable, stigmatized community members whose bodies are seen as publicly permissible, as violatable. I want to be in dialogue with you and ask you to point out how your South African history of apartheid, of multi-faith cultural religious diversity, conflicts with the accounts of moral economies that I want to stress, or that you might think is ill-fitted for your context. I know that you'll tell me. You'll tell me what sounds like a wrong-headed, arrogant, imperialist US perspective masquerading as universal truth. Because one of the things that I love about South African gender violence activist leaders is how frank and direct they are, how they're about, let's get to the real work. So one of my earliest quests in my work for some means of breaking open our comprehension of the role of racism and spirituality in violence, in gender violence, I found that we needed to magnify our capacity to learn from the experience of gender violence. Focusing on the experiences of Black US women, I wanted to stress the intersectionality that is there and take seriously that intersectionality. For example, US Black women are often referred to and have a self-perception of being strong, and thus, when abused or assaulted, can be caught in a false dichotomy of victim versus survivor, where victim is equated with utter blameworthy powerlessness, and survivor is equated with a kind of indomitable strength. So when a Black heterosexual Christian woman is assaulted, she can be seen as culpable for the abuse in failing to be strong enough to satisfy her domestic abuser, as he will keep reminding her. She can be seen as failing to have faith that's strong enough to pray away her abuse, as the church will continue to remind her. She can also be seen as a failure to be strong enough to be economically self-sufficient, particularly if she is poor and relies upon some form of public assistance. She's deemed a lazy Black woman, failing constantly before this omnipresent white capitalist God who judges her. She can be blamed by Black community leaders for being not strong enough to handle the problem without calling in outside intervention, such as calling in the police, or even sometimes going to a therapist in a crisis moment that she may be experiencing. One Black woman victim survivor that I quoted in this project said, quote, "I did not think that he, the abuser, was a god, but I was writing on the wall, Sarah is nothing, Sarah is nothing. I had no explanation for why I did that until now. I was in a war with no allies, no one to come to my defense," unquote. As Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins explains in her book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, intersectionality is not a theory of identity. It's a metaphor for the connectedness of different systems of power and enables us to analyze power relations and political identities. In this case, intertwined and fluid systems of power and control exercised culturally and politically and religiously and socially that constitute economies of support for gender violence. This is why it was so clear to Sarah that she was nothing. An intersectional approach enables us to break out of an incident-based, individual approach to the experiential, and instead recognize the racialized, gendered power relations that create moral impunity, where her victimization is not seen, is not allowed, and the life-endangering consequences that result. As one Black counselor I interviewed for that project commented on how her peers at a domestic abuse shelter where they worked, they had a crisis hotline, and she described how her peers could not hear the panic and the crisis in Black women's voices. That some of her white peers said that they always sounded, the Black women who called always sounded so strong and did not need immediate intervention of access to shelter. The consequences are life endangering. So I ask you, does this emphasis on a starting point that focuses on the experiential, does that have resonance in your leadership practices in South Africa? Or are you kind of bored with that as a starting point? Do you find that dissatisfactory? Another methodological move that I want to make is to go beyond urging clergy and counselors to grasp the wells of intersectional personal political knowledge that are in the anguish of the experience of violence. I want to go beyond that and focus on how, when it comes to gathering knowledge about economies of violence, we must refuse to accept a theory-practice divide in our approach to identifying what's wrong. That the real-life stories of women's experiences with sexual violation can enable us to clarify the meaning of basic moral concepts that are used, for instance, in Christian social ethics. I want us to see how understanding universal concepts, modes of conceptualization of Christian social ethics can be directly informed by the urgent problem, by the lived story of women's experience of sexual coercion. Christian ethical thought and ethical practices forged together in a dialogical relationship can foster more meaningful, more creative, liberative moral economies that can be better equipped at opposing economies of violence. So, for example, one example, I thought about these universal terms of autonomy and relationality that are often part of conversations in Christian social ethics. And what would it mean to put our understandings of these terms in conversation with an account that I read of a lesbian Latina prisoner named Florence R., who described her experience of being sexually assaulted while she was in prison by a prison guard. And then she complained about it. And what would it mean to try to understand how categories of sexual and gender identity help to determine how her autonomy was restricted, even in prison, by prison authorities who rebuffed her complaints of sexual assaults? So most commonly, definitions of human moral qualities that are based on individual needs. They're based on talking about what it means to be autonomous, what it means to be in relationship. That's often called ontic. It rests on the ontic. But those definitions are inadequate because they ignore the communal role. That is, when we put it in conversation with the experience of Florence R., they ignore the communal role, how heteronormative femaleness and maleness matter for defining human autonomy and relationality. They ignore how practices matter. The practices that were carried out of collective, coordinated, systemic anguish that she was forced to experience through not only the assault, but the relentless harassment after she complained of the assault and the homophobic slurs that she had to endure. This particular situation of this woman who literally has nothing materially, she's in prison and is assaulted, it illumines the universal ethical principles, makes them comprehensible for the construction of a moral economy that counters the well-supported violent ones, shifts our whole broader conceptualization of what is moral and how we define what is moral. In your leadership strategies and your learning communities, do you find that the theory-practice divide matters as you build anti-racist gender justice? Is it important that these principles be directly in relationship with certain marginalized lives? Which ones in your South African context? And does that dialogue help to open up moral imaginations in the ways in which I am positing is necessary? Finally, I want a methodological focus that's not just focused on knowledge and what it means to have an understanding, deepen our understanding, expand our understanding, but knowledge about action, about activist ways of creating change. When I visited Cape Town, it was my experience of the activist group Free Gender, committed to open and affirming spaces for gender expression by Black lesbians, that deeply inspired my focus on the need to create free gender space as a form of defiant spirituality. So I visited this amazing community of Free Gender and these leaders, and it helped me to see the kind of defiant spirituality that we need, that has to be a transnational Africana solidarity, but it's a queering method of disruption for economies of violence. It's a queering way of disrupting economies of violence. It means defying cultural and political indifference to the targeting of non-binary, queer, trans, and lesbian members of our communities for rape and murder, as well as the suicides that occur in our communities, here in the United States and there in South Africa as well. And it means this kind of defiance of these ways of targeting and the resulting loss of life and dignity that are so strongly embedded by religious heteropatriarchal hate and stigma and ostracism. The defiant spirituality that we need encapsulates something that I witness in the rituals and activities of the Free Gender group that I visited there in South Africa, in the Cape Town area. It represents expressions of timeless allegiance that insists on the irreducibility of queer existence, that stands in the face of confronting that communal message that the violence intends about the reducibility of lesbian humanity to objects. The defiant spirituality, it also requires a truthfulness about hypocrisy, a truthfulness about the hypocrisy that can infect us and seep into our consciousness in a way that creates an inertia, a malaise in the face of economies of violence. So the defiance of that spirituality has to confront hypocrisies like in South Africa, that you all have the most progressive constitutional sex, gender equality protections, perhaps in the world, or among the most strong protections in your constitution, and one of the highest rates of gender violence. hypocrisies like here in the United States. We're always proclaiming our exceptionalism in terms of notions of equality and freedom, yet we have no gender equality constitutional protections. We cannot even get to this day. People are still fighting. I'm going to a meeting next week, fighting to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. We cannot get a constitutional protection that endorses gender equality. Our nation now writhing in a Black Lives Matter protests that are going on across our country and pushing the white public to confront the hypocrisy in the legacy of racism that is in the marrow of the foundations of our nation and our culture. Yet too often we are failing to name the rape culture that is inherent in that racist legacy of our founders. The kind of defiant spirituality that we need requires truthfulness about betrayals, the betrayals by racist gender violence movement leaders. I don't know, you may not have any there, but we do have some here. Betrayals by misogynist clergy who talk about Christian love, who even sometimes talk about racial justice while fomenting hate violence against LGBTQI plus members of our communities and protecting heterosexual domestic violence abusers in their midst. And the hypocrisy and betrayals of so-called radical academics who precisely insist on splitting off theory from the real lived realities and consequences of abuse. Defiant Africana spirituality's capacity to evoke hope relies on these defections from religiously held loyalties to hypocrisy, loyalties to a malaise in the face of the hypocrisy. Nurturing such disruptive critiques is an essential methodological tool. Indeed, we need a blackening immersion in analysis of experiential knowledge of victim survivors and of risk-taking leaders for the sake of transnational solidarity. Such a blackening immersion can leave a mark of hope for ending the violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Tracy West. Again, it's so difficult to do this in this online space. I feel like I need everyone to give us a round of applause or to acknowledge this moment, Tracy, and it's so difficult to do this in this online space. It really, truly is difficult, but I hope that you're feeling the energies and some of the positivity that is coming your way. I see the chat is going crazy, and I should have got a degree actually in media because I'm not sure how I'm going to manage this moderation, but I will try my best. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you so much. And so with that, I want to try to moderate this question and answer session. And the two phrases I think that that jump out at me, and I want us to consider as we moderate this chat and we engage in conversation with you. The two phrases that jumped out for me is moral impunity and moral permission, because I think we so often just gloss over that there is moral impunity and there is moral permission given for the violence that we experience. But thank you again for the lecture. It was truly engaging, I think, of the multiple challenges we face as we confront the Economies of Violence. And so I am going to open for questions and direct engagement with you via the chat, Tracy. But I would like to, if I may, abuse my position of chair and say what I appreciated most about the lecture, and perhaps that may also invite a further conversation. The first thing I think is this notion of disruptiveness. Thank you for laying out so clearly the main paradigm for ending the violence as disruptiveness. Indeed, we know how the economies of violence displace and disempower us, and often we focus on that disempowerment and displacement in our research. But I appreciated your call for us to disrupt these narratives of displacement and disempowerment that is so endemic in our responses. As I said earlier, this narrative that dominates the popular imagination is often that women are weak, or women and Black people are powerless and need protection, etc. But it seems that what you invite us to do is to disrupt this narrative and to call these moral economies to account. And so I really, really appreciated that notion of disruptiveness. The second point that stood out for me, Tracy, is I liked the fact that you asked us to stop engaging the problem of violence as crisis intervention. And I was so grateful for you pointing this out, because so often in all our interventions, and especially during COVID, we're focusing on collections for shelters and GBV hotlines, etc. And then again, we seem to gloss over and to disrupt the deeply held beliefs that sustain the violence, because we're so busy building shelters for women who are abused, etc. Because building shelters and setting up hotlines and teaching women about self-defense is not going to help unless we deal with the foundations of that violence. So thank you so much for calling us to account on that. And the third point that stood out for me is your point about the paradox of the strength of Black women. And I saw that Nobesutu already picked up on this in the chat, how we glorify Black women's strength in the face of adversity. And there's a fundamental problem, right, with glorifying survivorhood and condemning victimhood as mutually exclusive options for Black women, between seeing them as super strong with lots of agency, as you say, or super submissive with no agency, as you put it. And I think we may very well need to get to the point of seeing the strength of Black women as simply strength in its own right. When Chadwick Boseman passed away this past weekend, I saw in one of the posts, I think in the Jimmy Fallon Facebook post, where he invited people to come and speak to a screen about what the movie meant to them. And one woman said, she said she loved the way Black women were portrayed in the movie Black Panther, because she says they weren't strong because they were angry. They weren't strong because they were hurt. They were strong because they were strong. And so, yeah, I think maybe we can have some conversations about that. So I'm sure you've been keeping an eye on the chat as well. But maybe let's start then with that question from Nobesutu. What can we do, she says, to break out of the strong Black woman narrative?
Thank you so much. So can you hear me? I'm just making sure you can. So I am so excited and grateful for the opportunity to be here. And so that's what I want to begin with is I'm just really grateful, and I appreciate the remarks and acknowledgements from the Dean of the Faculty and the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor and Dr. Lee. So thank you for connecting me with this community, this learning community. And I am trying to keep track of the chat. There are a lot of questions that bring up wonderful questions and issues related to these issues of misogyny and racism and homophobia and stigma. And so I just see lots of really important and sort of the resiliency of racism, and making connections between some of the conversations that exist there in South Africa. So I want to really emphasize that I see this wide range of questions, and maybe we can come back to some of them, or maybe we could just at least acknowledge that these kinds of connections are there and deserve attention. But the strength issue, I'm happy to work on and to think about. I feel so strongly that, sorry to use that word again, strongly. I feel so fervently that one of the challenges of this work is a lot of binaries and the ways in which we have these polar ways of understanding sex and gender. And I use this strong Black woman as an example of a binary mode that relates, I think it directly relates also to this issue of economies. I love this topic that you all invited me to explore, because economies is fundamentally about what it is we know to be resources and how those resources get controlled. And one of the things we think we know about Black women, at least, especially in the US context, is we know, and Black women often think they know about themselves, this resource of strength. And so what does it mean in this context to be limited to a sense of literally your victimization is denied, is dismissed, because you are known as exclusively strong in a way that is seen as it takes away your just your basic humanity in a way, right? Because vulnerability is an essential part of our humanity. And also, I also feel very strongly that connects directly to spirituality. That one of the reasons that it's so key for us to include and to center spirituality, both its use in the perpetration of abuse and violence, and it as a resource, is because vulnerability is so key to spirituality, right? And it can be used as a way of stigmatizing and abusing, and it's that intimate space that is systemically targeted, right? But also at the same time, it's that intimate space that can be a well that one can pull from and draw from, and it includes this deep vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right?
Thanks.
And how can you strengthen that way? So,
yes. You were talking about the systemic, systemic injustice, and then the individual vulnerability and the intimate space of vulnerability. Just, I noticed a question by Tammy, who's one of our PhD students in our cohort, who asked a question precisely about that, who poses the question, as important as it is, and we do this, right, in our work, as important as it is to point out the systemic and structural injustice, is it also maybe important to start unmasking, as she puts it, even in COVID, the human face of this phenomenon, so calling people personally to account, right? And I think that's related also to a question by an anonymous attendee, so I don't know who this is, who says gender-based violence can be frowned upon by men of power in the open, but endorsed by the same men of power behind closed doors. And we've seen this in South Africa as well, in the past few months of COVID as well, where because we focus so much on the structural, we take away a little bit from individual accountability. So is there a way to hold these two things, together?
Yes, a way, and it is of course absolutely crucial. One of the pieces that I emphasize, and I don't want to do this to the exclusion of the everyday realities of violence, but one example that speaks to it is the hypocrisy of leaders in particular. So that to me feels like a place where it's always about individual accountability for the ways in which leaders both make these public pronouncements often about their opposition to violence, or sometimes about their support of women in some general and in my view fairly meaningless way, but will make some sort of pronouncements. But then their behavior and their behavior in terms of their like crucial practices. So I just want to make sure that it's never an exclusive moment that's about two people by themselves, but the practices that get put in place that support that behavior and also keep that behavior from having accountability. So what about the ways in which Zuma, your former president, correct? Who the kind of, how was race an issue in the kind of blaming of the victim of the Black woman, right? Who was victimized by Zuma, and how was race an issue in the United States in terms of Trump and the women who accused him of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and the kind of blaming that he did many white women of those white women and the kinds of claims that they made against him. So I'm interested, I'm giving these two examples deliberately to help us to see how there are divergent narratives of race, of these very, very systemic, broader issues. But what a wealth of knowledge and understanding of how we organize and we create this kind of transnational solidarity in understanding all of these ways in which these individual actions by these individual actors have these broader symbolic value, symbolic influence, and also practical, broader, global, practical influence in keeping the structures of violence in place. And so just even thinking about those differences allows us to see both these individual needs to hold people accountable and the struggle to do that, but also the ways in which we can be equipped with seeing that, chameleon-like capacity.
Yeah. And the way in which that violence is embedded in other systems, right? And I think what you point out so well in your lecture also was the ways in which someone can, the ways in which leaders, moral leaders, speak with forked tongues almost, right? So on the one hand, they'll denounce racism but uphold sexism, or they'll denounce sexism but they'll promote queerphobia. And I think Jeremy Pint, welcome Jeremy. Jeremy's a New Testament professor. It's so weird to say welcome to people in this online platform at Stellenbosch University. He says, many thanks to Prof. West for an engaging presentation, stimulating in so many ways. And he's asking about the relationship between misogyny and homophobia. Is the problem really with our understanding of gender and sex or sexuality? Or, he says, is it deep-rooted normativities of various kind? What do you think sits behind the connection? Sorry, I'm shifting the discussion again, but only because we have limited time and it's so difficult to do this via the chat, but I hope you get the question, yeah.
Yes, and also thank you for these questions. And can I just say my very brief trying to respond just to the complexity of the questions. And so I apologize for just trying to say something in response, but certainly not adequately or nearly as comprehensively addressing the kinds of issues that are raised. And this is a case in point. I'm especially interested in sex and gender and their in our definitions of sex and gender, and especially the ways in which churches, religious communities, and the religious community that in which I spend the most time is a Protestant Christian community, and the kinds of just really strongly reinforced misogynies that enable the binary understanding of sex and gender and create a moral mandate to maintain this binary understanding of sex and gender, and what gets assigned to femaleness, the kinds of qualities and traits that get assigned to femaleness as and held up as what is a moral exemplary example of femaleness, reek of misogyny, and then therefore all of the non-binary persons, communities, get completely absorbed in those frameworks of really, I'm going to use hate, and I want to be careful with that because it's a strong word. But
I think hate is the right word. Thank you.
Yeah, of hate, which gives permission for a really wide range of practices of violence. So I want to say a very wide range of practices of violence. And so, yes, so especially for those of us in religious and church communities, that I don't think that's the only way to go, but that's a really important way to go. And because I'm interested in the intersection of race and racism, and that's in part why I came to South Africa, because you all are so clear about the need to address issues of race and racism, that is the context in which we are always operating. And to see, right now we're in the middle of a really, really wide-scale racial justice movement, very wide and very diverse, and increasing in its violence in several communities. And in many ways, people are now predicting that violence is helping to influence a lot of white US voters, and will influence perhaps the outcome of our upcoming presidential election. So the ways in which the racial justice calls have ignored the issues of gender and misogyny, and especially some of the religious leaders who are who are some of the primary spokespersons in some of these racial justice movements, although not exclusively, to me reinforces our ability to ignore the tremendous suffering of transgender members of our community. So I could give lots of examples, but I won't, because I know we are we're trying to sort of wrap it up and pull things together. But anything from, we have a rule that was just made here in the United States by one of our leaders that transgender homeless people are not permitted to be housed in federally funded homeless shelters. So just to give one small example of the ways in which some of the poorest, usually persons of color, the vulnerability gets reinforced. And so the larger racial justice frame doesn't include some of those gender justice issues. And then therefore those who are most vulnerable get even more targeted and subject to more forms of, at the very least, tremendous vulnerability to assault and violence and deprivation and stigma.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I think I'm glad that you got to that point of the intersecting nature of the domination and the violence. In fact, that just came up as a question as you were getting to that point about the ways in which some movements for justice exclude others. And so the question was actually about if we just focus on gender-based violence, are we also excluding other forms of systemic injustices? And I think your question did justice to that question itself. And so thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time on this online platform for further conversation. As I said at the beginning, a very disembodied conversation, not the ideal, but we tried our best to engage as much as we can. For those of you who tuned in, it feels like we're really doing TV here, but for those of you who tuned in, there will be a recording of this event, which we'll be happy to put up on our Facebook page and on social media as well, so that maybe further engagements can be continued. So but we have to bring this to a conclusion. Again, thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you for pointing out these moral economies that need dismantling and disrupting. It really was just such a powerful lecture. We're just so grateful for your time. Thank you, and I'm going to hand.
I'm so honored to have had the opportunity to be with you all.
Yeah, it was wonderful. We were very worried about the platform, but I think it worked reasonably well. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Sharnik Udemans, but thank you again, Tracy. I should.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Please stay with us just for another few moments while we do our thanks. I want to call upon Nobisutu Tom, who is a master's student in the center. Her work is in the area of indigenous knowledge systems, and she is exploring the decolonial turn in the study of African traditional religions. So what Nobisutu will do is she will do a vote of thanks. Thereafter, she will hand back over to me and I will do the concluding remarks. Thank you, Nobisutu. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lee. And what an amazing lecture. The questions truly insightful. Thank you, Dr. Tracy. And so, friends and colleagues, we have come to the end of what I think was an emotionally charged and thought-provoking afternoon. Despite the disruption of COVID-19 on all our lives, we have managed to connect and engage in a different and new, sometimes difficult, sometimes unfamiliar, but surprisingly fruitful ways. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to thank those who have contributed to making this possible. Firstly, thank you to our sponsors, the EMW, the NRF SACHI Chair for Religion and Social Justice, that is Professor Nadar, the Loan Mission, who support the work of the Desmond Tutu Centre. We thank you, Flock Events, for assisting us in holding this professional and well-organized event. We would also like to thank the university executive team, as represented by the Chancellor Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, the Rector, Professor Taron Pretorius, and the Arts Faculty Dean, Professor Monwabisi Kgalagala, who took the time to attend and welcome us today. Thank you to Professor Phumla Gqola, who took the time out of a busy schedule to sign her books for our book giveaway. To the students of the Desmond Tutu Centre who have participated in today's program in many ways, we say thank you, colleagues, for your participation and your joint commitment to the work of social justice. Veronique Jefters, thank you for your words. Jennifer Nash says that poetry has been one of the most successful tools Black feminists have used to think through and discuss intersectionality. Thank you for helping us to evoke emotion and thought in powerful and change-making ways. To Firial Mali, the center's administrator, we cannot thank you enough. We honestly cannot, Firial, for the hours and the hard work that went into putting together the many pieces of this event. Thank you. And finally, to Dr. Tracy West, on behalf of everyone in attendance, thank you for inviting us into conversation with you. You have reminded us of the complexities, the contestations, and the binaries present in racist and religious economies of violence. You have challenged us to be critical of the methods we use to dismantle these economies. And at the same time, you have opened up a space for what economies of violence quells, that is, hope for change. On top of this, you generously donated some of your books for our book giveaway today. Thank you for that. And above all else, thank you for your generosity, your presence, your time, your insight, and the challenge you put to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nobisutu. And with that, it is nearly time for us to say farewell, I suppose, but just a little bit more information about the center. So at the Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice, we work at the intersections and the imbrications of the complicated and often vexed relationships between religion, society, and the various iterations of what it means to be human and to live in a material world. Through feminist methodologies and intersectional theorizing of power and privilege, we work to find ways in which theory and praxis can be mutually constitutive, and we defy the ivory tower status afforded to the academy and to scholarship. And we defy the misguided notion that scholarship is ever neutral, which it's not, obviously. We maintain the tension between the notion that religion might hold resources that may offer hope and solution for how to overcome the evils and the violence that plague society. And we hold that together with the idea and the notion that religion and culture may galvanize efforts, or that might galvanize the efforts of those who seek to dominate and destroy. At the center, we work for more expansive ways of thinking about religion and about culture and its meaning in society, and also about considering where sources and from whom sources of knowledge may be found for these passages of thinking. For example, our recent reading group, the recent reading of our reading group has embarked on a project in public pedagogy that centers various women's intimate and spiritual experiences of a global icon, Beyonce. I invite you all to explore the work that we do as a center through our webpage, through our journal, the African Journal of Gender and Religion, co-edited by Professor Nada and by Dr. Fatima Sidat. This is still the only journal on the continent of Africa which considers gender as a critical intersection with religion and culture through engagements. That considers gender religion as a critical intersection with gender. What we do is impossible were it not for those with whom we work. And so the center is nothing if not a collaborative intellectual space. Our extraordinary students are the heart of the center. Their research is raising critical and creative questions about the intersections of religion, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, politics, media, race, and the environment. And we invite you to visit our webpage in order to find out more about the kinds of work that they are doing and the kinds of work that we support. So we want to thank some of our more intimate partners, those who work with us on our day-to-day projects. So in particular here, I'd like to acknowledge colleagues at UWC, notably Dr. Jonathan Jordamus, who is a scholar of gender and New Testament studies, also Dr. Demaine Solomons, who is a decolonial scholar in the study of religion, theology, and ethics, Dr. Suma Kwats, who's our faculty manager, but also an intellectual partner with the center, Prof. Adrian van Klinken from the University of Leeds, the Centre for Public, and he's also the director for the Centre for Religion and Public Life at Leeds University. Professor Azonze Uka, who is the head of department at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Cape Town, as well as Dr. Fatima Sidat from Gender Studies, also at UCT. Mika Vahakangas from Lund University in Sweden is also with us today. And all of these partners stand shoulder to shoulder with colleagues at the DTC as we carve out passages and portals for research, which is directed at dismantling and destroying systems of oppression. Finally, as a center that works at the intersections of popular and public culture, I think it is appropriate to end our proceedings in the following manner. Womandla and Wakanda forever. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening. Goodbye.